Welcome, I'm Bruce Munro, and with me is International Relations Specialist Professor Robert Patman, and this is Global Insight. Dramatic events have unfolded in Myanmar this week, with the army staging a coup against the government of Aung San Suu Kyi on the very day that that government was to reconvene. New Zealand has a special interest in Myanmar because that country's second Vice President, Henry Van Theo, lived in Dunedin for a number of years with his wife and children. It appears that Van Theo has been detained along with other leaders, but sources in Myanmar have told me this week that his wife and children are safe. Welcome, Robert.
Morning, Bruce.
Myanmar, formerly known as Burma, only had 5 years of democracy before the army took control again. Why has the army felt emboldened to take control at this time?
It seems to be that the army are very concerned. It was a landslide victory that Miss Suu Kyi achieved. And she, of course, is a well-known international figure. But the nature of the victory suggests that the military, which have been, the power behind the throne, very much on the throne for much of Myanmar's history since 1962, they embarked upon this democratic transition. I think, from the military's point of view, they may calculate that Miss Suu Kyi's political victory is such that the military may feel that their influence may be diminished by the circumstances in which the National League of Democracy, the NLD, have won. So I think there's a concern there about being marginalised. I think the military's idea of transition in Myanmar is that they retain the ability to determine the parameters. And I think the concern is that this sort of decisive victory suggests that perhaps from the military point of view in Myanmar, the Myanmar military, that the transition is actually going too quickly and that they're being phased out before they're ready.
China actually stopped the UN condemning what's happened in Myanmar. Could China possibly have had some sort of background role in this coup?
It's very difficult to know, and we don't know at this stage. But I'm wondering if the Myanmar military had sounded out China. What we do know is that China has faced a number of difficult challenges in the last year or so. We've seen the democratic protests in Hong Kong, and we've seen Taiwan's continued successful democratic evolution, which of course has been very unsettling. And it just occurred to me that the thought of a continuing success of the democratic transition in Myanmar may actually be something of a challenge to China. So it'll be interesting to know whether the Chinese leadership prefer having the Myanmar military back in charge rather than someone who's just been elected by a landslide, such as Miss Suu Kyi, and presiding over what appears to be a resurging democracy. Because that has, given the geographical closeness of the countries, that has implications for China.
I want to dig in a little bit to what you think is the right response and how those decisions are made. Should it be a strongly worded call for restoration of the legitimate government? Should it be sanctions against the military leaders to stop them travelling and banking? Should it be covert support of democracy groups within the country? Should it be storming the capital? How do diplomats and politicians weigh these things up and make these decisions about what is the right way to respond?
Well, I think it's very important, Bruce, that in a situation where there has been a landslide victory for one political party and the reasonably independent Electoral Commission in Myanmar have dismissed allegations which the military have made in sort of Trumpian style that there was massive fraud. And there's no international observers that back the military's version that the election was stolen. Given that reality, I think it's very important that the rest of the world reassures the majority of people in Myanmar they're on their side. How do they do that? I think it is, you have to increase the costs for the military, and that involves sanctions. They have to know they will pay a price if they interfere and try to overturn a democratic election, because that's what they're doing. They're overturning an election. I think those two things, sanctions and also quite robust condemnation, may set the scene. That I'm not sure that any other intervention really helps, because there may be, you see, the thing we don't know is how divided the military are in Myanmar. And I think any, if you like, counter-intervention, any intervention that comes in, whether it's covert support for democracy, could actually be counterproductive. It may discredit the democratic movement in Myanmar. And the other thing is, coming back to a point I just made, we don't know how much support there is for this action by the upper echelons of the military in taking power. There may be a difference of view within the military. There may be people in the Myanmar military who genuinely believe in the democratic transition and may not like what's going on. So you have to really, to answer your question, I think you have to frame a policy which is nuanced. I mean, it has to be clear and it has to be decisive, and it has to transmit a clear message, and it has to involve costs for this line of action. But it must also not do anything to strengthen the political position of the Myanmar military, which, of course, covertly supporting democratic groups using foreign money might do. It might actually, act as a rallying call for the military, saying, look, not only was the election fraudulent, but now the foreigners are trying to overturn our attempt to restore order in the country. And that could play into the Myanmar military.
So you think in the long run, Myanmar will end up as a democratic state?
I wouldn't like to be forthright. It depends what you mean by the long run.
Right.
I think in the long run that countries like China, Russia, and Myanmar will have to come to terms with the fact that large numbers of people in those societies don't necessarily accept the legitimacy of the idea of one party having a monopoly of political power. How that plays out remains to be seen. And I don't necessarily think you will get a sort of strict replication of the Western model of democracy everywhere. I'm not suggesting that. I'm sure it will have local features, and that's entirely healthy. But what I do think is, as the world becomes more interconnected, many people will become aware of how others live with greater freedom, and they may think it's time that they had that sort of freedom in their own lives. Of course, there's many challenges facing liberal democracies. How can we make the international economy work better for more people? And that's something that liberal democracies have to look. It's not as if we haven't got problems. We've got massive problems. It's just those problems probably are much less or pale into significance to some of the problems that many people in Russia and China, and unfortunately it looks like Myanmar, are facing.
So how should New Zealand be responding to this coup in Myanmar?
Well, New Zealand has expressed deep concern about the situation and said it had been a long time supporter of the democratic transition, which it has. So I think New Zealand struck the right tone, but I do think we need to be reasonably forthright that, we don't accept a military coup, and I think this is the way the government is framing its response. But I think the most powerful response for New Zealand is to align itself with like-minded countries and issue joint statements. I mean, 25 liberal democracies coming together, of which New Zealand should be one, and I think this is much more possible now that we have Joe Biden as president of the United States giving one message. I think that's very telling. And also it does make an impression on countries like China and Russia, who have stopped, I think, to some degree in the last 4 years. They have become skeptical about the United States. And you can't blame them in one sense, because after all, Mr. Trump's behavior after the November election meant that America was not in a position to point the finger about how other people arrange their democracies. America had weakened its ability to lecture others about democratic elections. But I still think with Mr. Biden in the White House, there are new possibilities now for countries like New Zealand, the United States, Australia, to give the military in Myanmar a very clear message.
So a very clear message. New Zealand also has quite an exchange program with students coming over here. We should continue those or discontinue those?
Well, I think it depends on the degree of the crackdown that follows. If it's a really, the other thing we haven't discussed, Bruce, is the reaction to many people in Myanmar to what's happened. If there are widespread protests and there's real crackdown, a repressive response to those protests, then I think we'd have to think hard about whether we can continue to go about business as normal. And this is what I meant by costs for the military regime. They have an interest in their citizens being educated and receiving the benefits of international exchanges. If their behaviour is such that we not only want to apply sanctions, but also we want to send a really clear message, then we may consider curtailing international exchanges.
Thank you, Robert.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. Catch us next time on Global Insight. Noho ora mai.